present Walton Tower was built by Trinity House. Yet in 1720 there had been a tower, and prior to this, for many years, there had been a building which stood out and could be seen from the sea. But Frinton, Walton, were both suffering from the same problem, the erosion of the land. Daniel Defoe in 1720 said that he had spoken to people who remembered in living memory over 30 acres falling into the sea. And the Naze is the Saxon word meaning the nose. And maps prior to this time show a large nose sticking out on the coastline. But as maps progressed with the number of years, so the nose diminished. But what is not fully understood is that Walton was a farming village. It was not near the sea at this time. It was only the sea encroaching upon the land and taking it away that ensured that Walton grew closer and closer to the coastline. And as shown here, Walton was then in the Naze. As will be seen in this map of 1779, it was only about this time that Walton actually became a fishing village. Up until then, the area had been completely involved in agriculture. 1732, when this was drawn of Walton, and there we see the church at the top of the hill, Walton consisted of basically 20 small houses. The community, it consisted of agricultural labourers, both in Kirby, Frinton and Walton, and their livelihood depended upon agriculture. Not only adults, but children as well. Unfortunately, in the 1830s, things happened whereby 12 farmers in the area all bought threshing machines. This created in the farm labourers' mind that their jobs were in jeopardy, and 200 of them gathered together and revolted, producing the tendering riots whereby they smashed the 12 machines that had been purchased in the area. That same night, 9 were hauled out of their beds, taken straight to Chelmsford, and within 1 week had been sentenced that they would all be transported to Van Diemen's Land, or as we know it today, Australia. Kirby had nearly 1,000 people at this time. It even had its own school, but the school was only open for 1 day of the week, on Sunday between 9 o'clock and 2 in the afternoon, because during the week children had to work. The sea's encroachment upon Walton happened not only on one side but the other as well. Yet in its way, this was to Walton's advantage, because one man saw the facilities and the potentials of the water. This was John Warner, who opened up a foundry, for he knew that the easiest way to transport his heavy goods was to send it on barges and shipping, as opposed to transporting it by cart and horse. So the growth of Walton was to begin. Here we see the foundry as it was at the turn of the century, and some of the goods that they were producing at that time, which were being shipped all over the world. In 1830, it was decided that a pier was needed, and a wooden structure was made. But it had one major problem. Not only was it very narrow, but it was also very short, which ensured that only the smallest ships could tie up, even at high tide. It was Peter Brough, more than possibly any other, that did most for Walton. For with his foresight, he saw the potentials of a proper pier, more hotels. The bathhouse had already been built. Mind you, the person that built it actually built it on land he didn't even own, which did create a few problems at the time. But then came along the old Albion Hotel. And the Portobello Family Hotel. The Marine Hotel, which boasted of having 100 apartments. It also had a variety theatre. Well, a theatre anyway. and the Clifton Hotel, which we know today as being the Pier Hotel. Because of the shortness of the first pier, a second pier was worked on. But that too was also far too short, and whilst longer than the original, it still was not long enough to accommodate the larger boats. And so money was once again gathered, able to actually accommodate 2 boats at a time. This ensured boats like the Queen of Orwell could call regularly to Walton. Following the Queens, there was the Bells and the Eagles. Here we see one of the Eagle coming into Clacton. It had probably just come from Walton, because there had always been, for many years, a situation where you could take a trip to Walton from Clacton and vice versa. Yet it was the railway that ensured the true growth of the area. Once the line had been built from Colchester towards Ipswich, it seemed a natural progression that the Tendring 100 line would be envisaged, taking it through Thorpe, Kirby, Frinton and Walton. And at Walton they built a magnificent railway station. But it was excursions, not only by train, but also by the Bell steamers, that ensured that at one time in the 1890s, during 3 months, nearly 50,000 people came to Walton-on-the-Naze, travelling as they would by train through Kirby Cross. And when they arrived at Walton, what they saw then is nearly what we see today. There have not been that many changes. True, the butchers no longer hang their meat outside, but quite a number of the buildings seen in these photographs still exist today. Often forgotten is the hut village. These were the beach huts, all magnificently put in line for the visitors to use. Building was one of the wonders of the Victorian era, the camera obscura. There were 2 of them in Walton. Kirby, though, at the turn of the century, had little changed from that which it had been 50 or more years earlier. And in fact, many of the buildings now seen in Kirby are exactly the same as we see here. the local policeman, and beside him the postman. And Kirby Key, in fact, had a customs man permanently on site right up till the 1850s. But as the trade grew less in Kirby and moved to Walton, so did he. Burnt House Farm was one of the properties that Peter Brough had bought. But it, like so many buildings in the past, it too was eventually to fall into the sea. As you went down the main road of Frinton, you'd go past the parsonage, then you'd end up alongside the Wick, still standing there, now the library. And then you continue down towards the church. At that time, there were only 4 houses, plus a small number of cottages in Frinton. The church itself, here seen in the 1780s, was classified as the smallest in Great Britain, but this is arguable. There was possibly one other smaller than this. And Richard Stone, in the 1830s, planted ivy, which was actually to run riot and take the building over, knocking down the bell tower and easing its way into the roof itself. And so the place had to be rebuilt and a new chancel added. Kirby, though, had been in such a bad state of repair that it needed a new building in the 1830s, which again was rebuilt in the 1870s. And the Stone family, who were to be linked directly to the rebirth of the Frinton church, the father, in fact, was buried here at Kirby. Walton Church, in 1798, was to fall into the sea, leaving just the porch. And for the next 6 years, marriages took place in that porch, as it was the only consecrated ground. Then, in 1804, a new church, followed by another on the same spot, but with a new tower. The building is exactly as it was built at that time. The life of Frinton began when the new station was opened, and although Peter Brough had set his eyes on Frinton to develop, he then turned his plans into Clacton, and so Richard Powell Cooper was the backbone of Frinton as it is today. Within 20 years of the station opening, there was nearly a complete town. The promenade wasn't built until 1902. Prior to that, the beach ended up as a higgledy-piggledy of tents, bathing huts, and, of course, bathing machines. The Beach Hotel. Sadly, this was struck by a bomb in the 1940s. The Queen's Hotel, another hotel which was to disappear with modern development. And on our right, the Grand Hotel. And one of the big draws that brought people to Frinton was, of course, the golf. Sport was regularly played on the greensward, not only with football, but cricket as well, and many other pastimes and activities were regularly to be seen on the greensward right up until the Second World War. And probably one of the finest grass-cutting machines known to man. Amongst the early visitors was Winston Churchill, and he and a vast number of people were to come to Frinton. The Dare sisters, Phyllis and Zena, musical Ivor Novello, and Gladys Keeper. She lived here for quite a number of years. There she is on the beach now on the right, and on the left, one of the Dare sisters. But at this time, you also had visits by King Zog of Albania. Later on, you would get von Ribbentrop, who was the German ambassador just before the last war. Douglas Fairbanks, the swashbuckler of all time, he came here with his third wife and his son, Douglas Fairbanks Jr. George Bernard Shaw, he came here quite a few times. And the writer who seemed to be more prolific than any other, Edgar Wallace. And did really Amy Johnson land her plane on the golf course when she came to visit friends in Frinton? Rumour has it she did. And of course, Edward and Mrs. Simpson. Mrs. Simpson had a house here, and Edward would come down to see her. And amongst the variety artists that were to stay here and live here in Frinton, Gracie Fields. Marconi also came, but not to just live here. He bought 2 houses and opened the very first residential telegraph school, which opened in 1901 and remained open for the next 3 to 4 years. And the mast towered above everything. Yet the most well-known product from Frinton and Walton was copperas. The most well-known, yet probably the least understood. It was a form of producing ink from products found on the seashore. And the barges would pick up the goods and take them round to the copperer's house. But they weren't paid in money as such, they were paid in tokens which they could change at the local shops. Most major farming communities had either a windmill or a watermill. Walton was no exception. And in fact, there was probably a windmill at Kirby, although that had been demolished and had disappeared centuries ago. The one in Walton, though, was there to produce all the flour needed for the residents of the tendering area. The watermill, because of where it was situated, regularly filled up barges and everything was taken to London for sale. In Walton, Halls were the boat builders and boat repairers, a family business which is still going today. And whilst Walton had its Warner's Foundry, Frinton had its Ratcliffe Brothers, makers of cycles, but they would also hire you a bath chair if you needed it, Every youngster wanted a bicycle in those days, as they do today. And the Ratcliffe shop was a centre for the area. But they just didn't involve themselves only in bicycles. It was the motor car that created and was to build the name of Ratcliffe in the area. But what is generally forgotten is that they also made something else. They made a grass cutter, the Ratcliffe grass cutter, and this in fact was dispatched and sold all over the world for many, many years. In Frinton, Parsons the builders were there to ensure that houses required were built. Most people that had deeds for their houses will find that when you bought a plot of land in 1900, you also agreed to spend at least £500 on building a house. A lot of money in those days. Kirby, as seen here, remained and was to remain a farming community. General Booth, it's unknown whether he ever came to Walton, but in 1882 the Salvation Army were to hold their first meetings there, and within a short time had taken over the public hall on a regular Sunday night basis. Kirby Methodist Church in fact stood on the corner of Chapel Lane. In fact, most Christian religions were to come to Walton at some time or another. In Frinton, the Methodists were to build a magnificent building in 1903. And it's still there today, slightly changed. And the Free Church held their first meetings in 1891, and it was in 1896 that the first Frinton church had been built. In 1911 we see here the laying of their foundation stone for the church, which was to open in 1912. Not so recognisable because it has no tower there, which didn't appear until much later. And this building at the bottom of Old Road was also used by the Free Church for a short while, but then it became the Gospel Chapel. In Walton, the Congregational Church was built in 1878, and the Boys' Brigade and Girls' Brigade, seen standing in front, have been part of that church for many, many years. In 1912, an event took place that was to affect Frinton for many years, and that has been CSSM, C-S-S-M, which started in 1912, where children come for a week, 2 weeks at a time, with their parents, and the parents know they can leave the children in the care of young adults.
This is my baby Chris.
On! What have you done?
Whoa, what you got? On the end of our nose. Whoa, what you got? On the end of our nose. It's a banana.
Would I sign? Simon S. Thank you. Thanks.
But there were more serious gatherings to be held on the coast, and especially at Frinton. when literally hundreds would gather for an event that took place not every year, but for many years, and that was baptisms at sea. What is most interesting about these pictures, they are Olive Luff, whose father was the founder of Luff's Homes in the area, and of course the bookshop. Small church is more well known, possibly, for its William Morris and Burne-Jones window, as opposed to it being known for the size of the church. But of course at one time they had to put a 500-seater extension onto it to accommodate the people. They then put in designs for a church to be built in Queen's Road. But this was turned down and it was redesigned. And in 1928 the foundation stone was to be laid by the Lord Mayor of London and his good lady. And then a year later, in 1929, the Lord Bishop of Chelmsford was to consecrate the new church. Yet the choir, they didn't worry whether they were singing at St Mary's or the new building, as long as they had their outing once a year. In Connaught Avenue, most know of the Catholic Church, being unaware that this was in fact Frinton's first cinema and theatre. And in the 1920s, the Imperial Hall was opened to fulfil just this same task of being a cinema and a theatre and to hold functions as well. And what is sad is that this building still retains many of the facilities that were built into it 50 years ago. One of the first people to ever use the hall was Stanley Holloway, who brought a troupe with him, and he paid £25 for 1 week's usage. But Stanley Holloway had been to Walton before when he was a member of the Co-optimists, and there he had appeared on the pier itself. Alongside the pier, for many years, the Pierrots. Yet in any town, much of the entertainment, off-season, was amateur. These were all local lads. But it can be stated that the great had come to Walton. Edmund Kean, Henry Irving before he'd been knighted. And at the Clifton Hotel, they too had entertainments, but not only within the hotel, but also outside, with the most popular seaside entertainment of them all, Punch and Judy. In the early 1930s, between Frinton and Walton, the Lido was built. It had a swimming pool, but unfortunately that, owing to subsidence, was never to hold water much longer than 1 year, and therefore it remained empty most of the time. But within it were restaurants and a place for entertainment. Yet unfortunately, within 4 years, in 1934, Frinton Park Estates was being envisaged. This was a most magnificent idea, with a place for a cinema, town hall, in excess of 1,000 houses, new streets, a brand new hotel on the front, and beside the hotel, a swimming pool and a restaurant. And as the Lido wasn't in keeping with what they foresaw, the Lido had to go. And although the war was to be blamed, Frinton Park Estates never established all the things that they stated would happen, with just a handful of houses. And, of course, a small shopping area, which today is not a shopping area, but the Freemasons' Hall. On the corner there was supposed to be a baker's shop. Yet those houses that were built still are a magnificent example of 1930s design. Had you gone through Walton at that time, you would have passed the church, past the Regal Cinema, and also many buildings that are still there. And as you turn left, looking towards the Marine, on the left you'd have found the Kino Cinema. The Kino, in fact, was taken over by the army during the war, returned to being a cinema, and now, of course, has changed to an amusement arcade. The Regal, built after the Kino, was to go in the 1960s. And was it when these pictures were taken at the turn of the century that one of the Oxley family got off the end of the pier, sat on a piece of ice and paddled it to the shore? This type of picture is not new to any of us, although these were taken some time ago. But every 20 or 30 years in living memory, and this is living memory going back 1,000 years, a disaster has hit. The Martello Tower was built to fend off Napoleon's potential armies. There were 3 of them in the area, 2 in Walton and 1 at Frinton. Guns are not new either to the area. In fact, one of the selling points of Frinton was, come to Frinton for the wildfowling in the backwaters. Before the First World War, at Walton there was a rifle range, which they extended from 400 yards to 800 yards. And members of the Frinton Club, 31 of them were to join regiments throughout the whole of the country once war was declared in 1914. Few actually ever returned when war ended. Here we see a group of soldiers that were actually posted at Frinton. And here the Ladies' Auxiliary, outside the YMCA at the bottom of Connaught Avenue, and amongst them Ursula Bloom, the well-known authoress. The hat she is wearing is black because her fiancé had just been killed at that time. Even when war finished, reminders would turn up on the beach. During the Second World War, Walton and Frinton were restricted areas, and gun emplacements were placed right along the coastline. The soldiers dug in. But what now is generally forgotten is that at Walton, this troop had a special task, because they were looking after a secret rocket launcher. Then, when war ended, there were the parties, the Victory over Europe party, the Victory over Japan, VJ Day. Yet it was the austerity of the time that helped bring about a new phase in holidays, the holiday camp. This is the Jubilee camp at Walton. But then people wanted more than just living under canvas. And so the caravan parks were to grow. Here, the Martello Towers, for well over 100 years, the men of Walton have been risking their lives. To this extent, 4 have gained silver medals and 9 have gained bronze medals for their bravery. The first station and the first boat, the boat was called the Honourable Artillery Company, and the building on the left is now the Heritage Museum. This boat, though, in its way, was strange, because the ramp that it was placed on initially took 2.5 hours to launch the boat, and it is stated that it was never less than half an hour at any launching that took place during the time that it existed. Frinton also had a lifeboat, the Sailor's Friend. started in 1901, and then they had another in 1907, also called the Sailor's Friend. But this boat, because it was manned all by teetotalers, it was launched with a bottle of seawater. But the Frinton boat was a voluntary boat, as opposed to most of the boats at Walton being RNLI boats, excepting for this one. This also was a voluntary boat stationed at Walton. And so, for many years, there were two boats at Walton. Yearly, every lifeboat in the country travels to the lightship. Always, once a year, they make this journey in all weathers to take with them the Christmas goods, materials and food, and even the tree for the men who will be stationed on the boat over the Christmas period. This has become a tradition. Parties are also a tradition, and of course Christmas itself is for children. After Christmas, and for over 20 years, there has been the hunt. During this time, they've only ever caught 2 foxes. And at Walton on Boxing Day, an annual fishing competition. Through the year, children go to school, and we hope learn. whilst today, once they get to a certain age, they go on to a comprehensive, 30 years ago, many children remained right up until they was 15 or 16 within the same school. Here we see two groups of children at Kirby. And Walton School. And a very early picture of a class at Walton School in 1912. Visitors to the area in the 1880s found that they could purchase gifts which had a transfer on showing Walton as they had seen it. But this ware was to be transposed by the famous Goss ware, the crested china. Here we see a crested china piece for Frinton-on-Sea. This crest didn't exist until Mr. Goss designed it. And great and interesting collections can be made just having the one crest. But like many towns, Frinton in fact had 4 different crests. Walton had 2 different. And through the year, visitors could see entertainments or competitions or events on the greensward at Frinton. Here we see the annual Fire Brigade event. At Walton, from the early 1800s, a regatta used to regularly take place once every year, and boating people from many parts of the East Coast would make the journey to Walton for this one event. And then in 1967 there came the Walton Carnival. There's the Walton Carnival Queen of 1967. And the way to gather funds for the lifeboat was to have the lifeboat procession. This took place within the 1930s. Here we have Frinton and their coronation procession of 1937. And as always, people would dress up for all events. Here is the Walton lifeboat crew in the 30s. Years later, we have, in 1977, the Jubilee procession in Frinton. How many, even today, can remember Walton Pier when it offered so much in the way of entertainment? A Ferris wheel, slides, roundabouts. In 1878, Walton had its first tennis club. But it was really in Frinton where things began to happen, when in 1902 they started their first tennis tournament. This tournament was to grow to the extent whereby 1 week before Wimbledon, nearly every major player in Great Britain played at Frinton. Everybody from Fred Perry, Dan Maskell, Christine Truman, they all played at Frinton at one time or another. And how many people can forget Popsy Bangs, the secretary of the tennis club, and his megaphone? These were the days before the microphone. Cricket is popular in all three areas. The Frinton team, and then the Walton and Kirby teams. All teams within this area have won the Tendring Shield. And where cricket's concerned, when they used to play the one match a year on Gunfleet Sands. Football also, just as popular. Kirby, Walton here, and followed by Frinton. Bowls has always been popular within this area. It was, of course, originally beside the Queen's Hotel. At Walton, the course was behind the Pier Hotel. Hockey also was played, But there were many other sports in the area. Water polo, very, very popular. Horse riding, as popular today as it was in the 30s and in the 1900s. Another sport that people have forgotten about is quoits. Today we think of quoits as being something played on board a ship. But before 1914 in this area, there were leagues and competitions regularly held. But like tennis, golf was one of the big draws to bring people to Frinton. And it can be said that literally every major name in British golfing, up to and including the 1960s, had come and played at Frinton at some time or another. This film, taken in the late 20s, was when the Ryder Cup team came to play at Frinton. And of course, in the 20s, the ladies had really taken hold of the game. What is now forgotten is that there was also a course at Walton-on-the-Naze in the 1930s. But whenever you get water, there'll always be people wanting to muck about in boats of all shapes and sizes. But to go round Walton, Kirby and Frinton is to see the many buildings which are over 100 years old in many cases. True, some have had a good lick of paint on them, one or two have got new windows, but the charm that makes these older buildings look rather special is still there. The Martella Tower, looking over the boats. In Kirby, there are quite a number of buildings which are 150 years old, and many far more. It makes this area such a charming place to be in, and we hope it won't change too much in the forthcoming years. Well, we'll keep our fingers crossed anyway.